The autumn wind carried the scent of hay and distant rain as Margaret stood at the edge of the Crawford ranch, her worn suitcase clutched in trembling hands. She had answered the advertisement for a housekeeper 3 weeks ago, desperate and nearly penniless, knowing full well that a woman with her past had no business hoping for kindness from strangers. Thomas Crawford had written back with surprising swiftness, offering her the position sight unseen, and now here she stood, 37 years old and carrying more regrets than possessions. Thomas emerged from the barn, tall and weathered like the oak trees dotting his property. His eyes held a gentleness that made Margaret want to weep. She had learned long ago that kindness was often a mask, but something in his steady gaze suggested otherwise. He extended his hand, calloused and honest, and she took it briefly before pulling away, unable to bear the warmth of human contact she felt she no longer deserved. The first weeks passed in careful silence. Margaret cleaned the sprawling house with methodical precision, preparing meals and mending clothes while maintaining a respectful distance. Thomas never pressed her for conversation, never asked about the shadows that haunted her eyes or the nightmares that made her cry out in the small hours of morning. He simply existed in his quiet, steady way, treating her with a dignity she had forgotten was possible. But the ranch had a way of breaking down walls. One evening, as Margaret prepared supper, a violent storm rolled across the plains. Lightning split the sky like divine judgment, and suddenly she was no longer in Thomas's kitchen but in another place, another time, watching flames consume everything she had loved. The plate slipped from her fingers, shattering across the floor, and she collapsed among the shards, sobbing uncontrollably. Thomas found her there, broken and bleeding from a cut on her palm. He knelt beside her without hesitation, carefully picking glass from her skin while she confessed everything through her tears. She told him about the fire 5 years ago, about her husband and 2 children who had perished while she was away, too drunk to be home where she belonged. She spoke of the guilt that had driven her from town to town, the bottle that had been her only companion, the shame that had stripped away everything except the will to survive another miserable day. When her words finally ran dry, Thomas simply bandaged her hand and made her tea. He sat across from her at the worn kitchen table and began to speak of his own losses. His wife Sarah had died giving birth to their stillborn son 15 years ago. He had blamed himself, had nearly sold the ranch and disappeared into his own darkness. But the land had held him, demanded his attention, forced him to continue living even when he wanted to surrender to grief. The months that followed brought a gradual transformation. Margaret began to allow herself small moments of peace. She found herself laughing at Thomas's dry humor, helping with the horses, even planting a garden come spring. Thomas, in turn, seemed to come alive in ways the ranch hands said they had not seen in years. He hummed while working, smiled more easily, and the house that had been merely a structure became something closer to a home. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance across the fields, Margaret finally voiced the fear that had been growing in her heart. She had fallen in love with this man, with this life, with the possibility of redemption she saw reflected in his eyes. But she did not deserve such grace. "You'll regret choosing me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the cricket song. "I'm broken, Thomas. I've failed everyone I ever loved. I'll fail you too." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun had painted the sky in shades of amber and rose. Then he turned to her, and his smile held more certainty than she had ever seen in another human being. "I only regret waiting so long," he said simply. He took her scarred hand in his, tracing the faded marks with his thumb. "Margaret, I've watched you fight your way back from darkness every single day. I've seen you choose courage when it would have been easier to run. You think you're broken, but I see someone who's been rebuilt into something stronger and more beautiful than before." Tears streamed down her face, but for the first time in 5 years, they were not tears of shame. Thomas pulled her close, and she finally allowed herself to rest in the shelter of his embrace. The wind carried away the last whispers of her old life, replacing them with the promise of new beginnings. They were married that autumn beneath the oak trees, with only the ranch hands and the endless sky as witnesses. Margaret had learned that redemption was not about forgetting the past or pretending wounds had never existed. It was about allowing someone to love you despite the scars. About choosing to believe that tomorrow might be gentler than yesterday. As Thomas slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, she finally understood that fate had not brought her to this ranch to hide from her pain.